I know for a fact that Craig killed Kevin. You know, because when Pat was in hospital, they went in laughing and telling Pat what they'd done to this fellow. And then Pat was telling me.
Around the time that Whittaker started dealing with Craig Rolfe, he also started up a relationship with Alison Pinkton. The relationship lasted several months, then the pair broke up. But after a few months, they decided to get back together again. Kevin told me that him and Alison were getting engaged, and they had set up a home together in Brackley Crescent, Pitsea, says Smith. It took me completely by surprise, as I wasn't even aware they were back together. A few weeks after that, in late 1993, Kevin told me that Alison was pregnant and due to have a baby the following June. He told me that he'd managed to stop taking cocaine altogether because he wanted to be a good father. Whittaker had also found paid work laying crazy paving with a man named Ronnie, and for the first time in his life he seemed to be generally stable. His parents noticed he was working hard, looking after himself, and saving to prepare for the birth of his son. They were pleased he had finally turned over a new leaf, but then disaster struck. Around April 1994, Whittaker and Ronnie had had a huge argument, and he suddenly found himself unemployed and with a baby due in only a few weeks. Desperate for cash to make ends meet, the temptation to go back to his old ways was simply too powerful to resist. Whittaker approached Rolfe, who offered him the chance to be a courier in a cannabis deal that he was putting together with the backing of Tucker and Tate. Whittaker's job was to collect the drugs from a firm in Manchester and then bring them back to London. But when the drugs arrived, there was a kilo missing. As Whittaker was the courier, the debt was down to him. He pleaded that the Manchester firm must have made a mistake with the amount, that they were probably trying to rip Rolfe and the others off. But Rolfe wouldn't hear of it. The debt was down to him, and it had to be repaid. Whittaker knew only too well what Tucker and Rolfe were capable of. He suspected that he himself might have been the victim of a setup, that Rolfe was just trying it on to line his own pockets, but he could never prove it, and he knew unless he got the money to pay the gang back, his life wouldn't be worth living. Towards the end of September 1994, Kevin Whittaker turned up out of the blue at his mother's workplace. He said, "Please can you help me?" Joan recalls. I said, "In what way?" He said he needed some money to get him out of trouble. I said, "What sort of trouble?" He said, "I can't tell you. I will one day, but I can't at the moment." I told him he'd have to come home and talk to me and his dad about it. Albert takes up the story. He sat us down. He was white as a sheet. You could see it in his eyes. He was very, very frightened. He explained that he desperately needed £2,500. He said he owed the money for drugs. He said, "I've been a fool. I need to finish with it and get out the drugs business, and this is the way to do it." He said that if he did not get the money, he would kill himself, that he would jump off the multi-storey car park or something. He appeared nervy and in trouble. I've never seen him in such a state. He'd never talked about committing suicide before, so we knew he was genuinely worried. It was a bad time for us. We were off on holiday to the Far East a few days later, but I decided to help Kevin in the hope that he would come to his senses, and it would be the end of it. On the 30th of September 1994, Albert made a cheque out from his Woolworth Building Society, amount for £2,000. Kevin had instructed his parents to make the cheque out not to him, but to Russell Tate, the younger brother of Pat. At the same time they handed over the cheque, Joan gave her son £500 in cash. The following day, Albert and Joan left for their holiday. They returned 3 weeks later to discover that Kellen and Alison had split up, and their son was now living with his friend, Simon Smith. Kevin ended up sleeping on a settee in my lounge, says Smith. He never confided to me the root of the problems between him and Alison, but he was clearly very upset by the whole incident. He wasn't taking much care of himself as far as personal hygiene was concerned. He never had a bath at my home, and he wasn't washing at all. The fact that he wasn't taking much pride with his appearance was out of character, but he was a clean, meticulous person. He was even sleeping every night fully clothed. He was obviously pretty down about things. On the morning of the Wednesday the 16th of November, Whittaker was preparing to leave Simon's house. I asked him if he wanted a lift to somewhere, and he said, "No, I'm meeting someone," and walked off towards Rectory Road. A little later, whilst driving his car, Smith parts a Vauxhall Corsa being driven by Craig Rolfe and spotted Whittaker in the passenger seat. I got home around 4 in the afternoon and found Kevin asleep on the settee. He woke up and we spoke about what he'd been up to that day. He explained that he and Craig were involved in a drugs deal. He said that he was getting something, Craig was getting something, that it was going to be put together to give to the same person. Kevin said that he was getting cannabis but didn't say what Craig was getting. I asked him if it was a good earner, and he said he was going to make a few grand. The following morning, Smith gave Whittaker a lift to his parents' house. Having got back from holiday, they had taken charge of the situation and arranged for Alison to bring their grandson to their house each afternoon from Thursday to Monday, so that their son could have access. Alison turned up a little later, and Whittaker spent the afternoon playing with his son and taking a few phone calls, including one from Simon Smith. "I planned to see Kevin and the baby that afternoon," says Smith. "We spoke on the phone late afternoon and he said he was waiting for a call from Craig and then planned to meet up with him. I asked if everything was alright and he said, yeah, I'll talk to you when I get back. When I turned up at his parents' house, they said I just missed him. I never saw him again." As the evening drew on, Albert and Joan became increasingly concerned about their son. Whenever he left them with the baby, he would always call every hour or so to check everything was okay. This was the first time he had not done so. "Kevin had seemed fine when he went out," says Albert. "He did not seem depressed or anything. The split up with Alison had upset him, but he seemed to be alright. There had been times in the week since the breakup that Kevin had been down, but he had not mentioned ended it or seemed particularly stressed since he had asked for the money." Nearly 30 hours after he left home, Albert and Joan's worst fears were realised at 10 p.m. on Friday evening when Detective Sharp and Detective Constable Mayo arrived at the house and asked whether the two of them would be able to travel to the mortuary at Basildon Hospital to assist in an identification. The body of Kevin Whittaker had been found face down in a ditch at the side of Dunton Road, Dunton, surrounded by a few odd bags of rubbish. There were no signs of violence, no obvious cause of death, until a closer examination revealed 5 puncture marks in his right forearm and elbow. A toxicology report from the Aldermaston laboratory found that Whittaker had cocaine, ecstasy and ketamine and lignocaine in his body stream. Each drug was present in high enough concentration to have caused death on its own. Police began interviewing Whittaker's friends and family to piece together his movements up until the time that his body was found. It was only a matter of days before Craig Rolfe was arrested. On December the 1st, 1994, he made the following statement at Basildon Police Station. "I met Whittaker at a friend's flat 5 years earlier. Over the 5 years, I got to know Kevin fairly well. Having said that, we're not particularly close, although I've done him a few favours in the past. We've only gone out socially together on one occasion. On average, I would see him 2 or 3 times a month. The last time was on Tuesday the 15th of November, around the mid-afternoon, when I saw him standing in a telephone kiosk in Rectory Road, Pitsea, making a telephone call. I stopped the car I was driving, a blue Vauxhall Corsa, and had a conversation for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. I then drove off and left him to walk to Simon Smith's house. The last time I spoke to him was between 3 or 4 on Thursday the 17th, when I phoned him from our home address to his father's address. The conversation lasted 5 minutes, and I can recall that he said he had been to see his little boy that morning. At no time did he mention that he was worried about anything, or that he had any problems, other than the fact he was a bit down having split with his girlfriend. That evening I went out to friends. I received a call on Saturday afternoon saying Kevin was dead. Rolfe's statement was supported by his girlfriend Donna Jaggers, who testified that he was with her on the night and at the time that Kevin was thought to have died. The two of them had stayed in to watch a video. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened. It was just a quiet evening in. Once the police had finished gathering their evidence, the most likely explanation, it seemed, was that Kevin accidentally overdosed. He had probably died at the home of a friend who, terrified at being implicated, had dumped the body in a ditch. But for Kevin's parents and his close friends, that simply didn't add up. For one thing, Kevin had an absolute fear of needles. A few years earlier he had been bitten by a dog and his family tried to take him to hospital for a tetanus injection. It kicked up such a fuss that they eventually agreed to drop the idea. Then there was the fact that the puncture marks were on Kevin's right arm. Kevin was right-handed. For him to inject himself in such a spot would be physically impossible. "There's no way my son died by accident," says Albert Whittaker. "It was murder." It would take nearly 2 years for the truth to emerge. Having narrowly escaped to good hiding over the missing cannabis fiasco, Whittaker had been wary of dealing for Craig & Co. again. But when in November 1994 they offered him the chance of coming in on another deal, it was too good an opportunity to miss. A buyer had come to Rolfe asking for 25 kilos of cannabis, worth around £60,000. Rolfe didn't have access to that much straight away, but didn't want to lose the deal, so he stalled while calling around everyone he knew in order to put the stashes together to make the full amount. Whittaker knew where he could get hold of a large amount of cannabis on short-term credit, and at a discount for buying in bulk, and realised that this was his chance to make some proper money for once. Based on his contribution, he should have made at least £5,000, but once the deal was in place, he was told that he was only going to be paid £2,000, barely enough to cover the cost of the drugs themselves, and leaving him with no profit at all. It was then that Whittaker made the biggest mistake of his life. He complained. Rolfe promised to sort it out, and after discussing the situation with Tucker, called Whittaker on the Thursday to invite him over to his house on the pretext of wanting to arrange another deal to boost Whittaker's profits. At first, it all seemed plausible enough. Whittaker arrived to find Rolf, Tucker and Rolf's girlfriend in the front room drinking. He was offered a beer and sat down to join the conversation. But as he drank, he began to feel a little woozy, and then he found he could no longer stand properly or see clearly. By the time he realised his drink had been spiked, it was too late. Tucker had always suspected Whittaker of stealing the missing kilo of drugs. It was he who led the inquisition. "Like drugs, do ya? Well, here, have some more. Here, have all the drugs you want." Whittaker was held down and injected time and time again with Special K, ketamine and cocaine, while being bombarded with questions about his suppliers. He finally slipped into unconsciousness, and his limp body was taken through the interior door to the garage where a Vauxhall Corsa had been hired especially for the task. He was driven to Dunton, where his body was dumped. The car was valeted twice before being returned to the hire company. None of this was known when the inquest into Kevin Whittaker's death was held in January 1995 at Chelmsford Coroner's Court. Detective Inspector Peter Hamilton explained that the police had investigated a suggestion of murder connected with a drugs deal, but had found no evidence. The file had been closed. The court also heard evidence from Craig Rolfe, who turned up with Tony Tucker. He repeated what he'd said in his statement and took the case no further. The coroner, Dr. Malcolm Weir, had no option but to support the police line on the death, that the 28-year-old had all but taken his own life. Depressed about the split from his girlfriend and the loss of his job, he had started to inject hard drugs but had accidentally overdosed. After the inquest, Rolfe and Tucker and a few friends celebrated with a night on the town. No one could deny they were on the up and up. No one could deny that they had ascended to new heights of criminality and they were joining the ranks of the elite. The two of them had literally got away with murder.